What does it mean to be an adult? I ask this question because when I became a physical adult, when I became a legal adult after 18, into my 20s, even into my 30s, I would look inside myself often and say, do I feel like an adult? I look in the mirror and I see, obviously, I have certain characteristics of being an adult, but deep inside myself, and sometimes not so deep inside myself, I didn't feel like an adult. The funny thing was, on the surface, I was doing a lot of very adult things. I had my own apartment, had a lease, sometimes had a girlfriend, had a job, made money, paid taxes, functioned as a civil member of society, did my jury duty, went on vacations, had a passport, did all sorts of things that adults were supposed to do, was responsible. Yet on the inside, still, some part of me just felt like, I don't really feel like I can say I'm an adult. And what did I feel like? I felt like a kid in a lot of ways. And so I want to try to tease out what is an adult versus what is a child, really. Now, the simplest way to look at it is just in the biological sense of the word. And so that probably takes about 10 seconds of my time to explain. An adult is someone who is fully grown, has gone through puberty, I guess, to one degree or other, could reproduce, and is someone who is considered grown up, no longer physically a child. And that's easy. And I think a lot of people, that's enough to have, to call oneself an adult. But to me, that didn't really work. Then comes the second part, being an adult in the eyes of society. And all those things I talked about. Working, I think a lot of it is like having a partner is considered very important for being an adult. So having a partner, having money, having a home, having all the things that people consider being successful in society, those are all signifiers of being an adult. Being able to maintain responsibility, being reliable, showing up for when we're supposed to show up, paying our taxes, things like this. Practicing self-care, physically going to a doctor, going to the dentist, etc., etc. These are all things that society considers to be signs of adulthood. However, the problem is society is often very, very screwed up. So sometimes the people who can seem the most like adults often are not really emotionally much adults at all. So right away, if someone has a great job and is making tons of money, they're considered an adult in society. A male person is considered a man if he can make lots of money and have a girlfriend and have a nice place to live. But emotionally, he can still be very much a child. So to me, society's idea of what an adult is can be very, very confused and screwed up and sometimes just plain wrong. And I think that was something that was very hard for me to weigh when I was asking myself, why do I not really feel like an adult in a lot of ways? Now, to add one more piece of confusion is the part about children who sometimes are required in their childhood by their parents or their situations to be adults. I've heard a lot of people say, oh yeah, I had to become an adult at 14. My parents died, or one of my parents died, or I had to go to work, I had to take care of myself, I had to become a wage earner, I had to labor, I had to look after my parents who were ill. I had to become the parent in this situation, parentified children. And so what I think, and this happened to me in some ways also, on an emotional level, because my parents were so immature, because they took so little adult responsibility in certain areas of their relationship with me, in their personalities, I emotionally had to behave like an adult. And in a way, I sort of was an adult. I had to take on a lot of adult emotional responsibility as a child, as a teenager, even before I was a teenager. Before it was appropriate, before I was ready to take on those adult responsibilities. And I see that a lot, little children, and sometimes their parents are very proud of them. Often society says, wow, that child is so mature for their age. They're really an old soul. They're 13, 14 years old, and they have such wisdom. They have such insight. They really are like a little adult, or they really are a full-on adult. And my question is, because this is something I learned about myself, my question is, at what cost? What is the cost of being an adult before you're really emotionally ready to be an adult? For me, the cost was I wasn't allowed to be the kid I really needed to be in order to grow. I didn't have the freedom to play in the way that other kids could have played so easily. I had all sorts of adult burdens on my shoulders, things that I had to think about, things that I had to weigh in when I made my decisions that forced me to be older than my age. And what happened is that didn't allow me to heal the traumas that I had suffered before. I couldn't just sit back and relax and let myself grow. Also, I had to put aside all sorts of things that were more age appropriate. I wasn't allowed to make certain mistakes that other teenagers were allowed to make, that I needed to make. I had to bypass all that mistake-making process and jump forward into being mature, responsible. I had to shut down a lot of my emotions in order to survive in my situation. And in a lot of ways, the world really rewarded that. And I see that with so many adults. When adults lose their emotions, when they lose all sorts of feelings, sadness, joy, anger, frustration, they're basically become more and more emotionally dead. A lot of times the world, especially if the world can see that they're doing other adult things like working, making money, paying bills, being responsible members of society, even though they're all emotionally split off, the world really rewards that and says, that is an adult. And that's really, really screwed up. And to me, that goes right back to childhood. That goes back to childhood stuff, where children were not allowed to really be children and work through their stuff and grow and feel and make the mistakes that children need to make in order to learn certain things about right versus wrong, learn how to hold the whole range of emotions that we have, the spectrum of feelings that we have. Instead, when parts of that range of feelings get shut down, well, we lose things, and we can look like an adult. We can simulate being an adult on the surface, but underneath it, what you really have is a very shut down and unconsciously confused, wounded child. And in many ways, I think less than a lot of people, but definitely still significant in my case. That's what I was. I was someone who looked like an adult in some ways, but underneath it, I had a lot of brewing, unresolved traumas. I had a lot of split-off feelings. And what I knew, somehow, unconsciously, is that I really, fundamentally, at a deep emotional level, was not really an adult. Yet. Not fully. And what was I? I was someone who was hurt. And the reason that I'm so glad that I was able to admit to myself that I really wasn't an adult is that meant to me that I still had some self-reflective capacity, and that self-reflective capacity allowed me to keep healing and to keep growing and to keep looking at myself. Because also, I think it wasn't something when I looked in the mirror inside myself and said, ooh, I don't really feel like an adult. I feel kind of like, not exactly like a child, but kind of like a child. That wasn't an answer that I liked to hear. It didn't make me feel good about myself. I didn't want to go off and tell the world, oh, I don't really feel like an adult. It's like, no, it wasn't something I was proud of. But it was true. And it was something that I needed in order to grow. Because I needed to have that in order to open the door inside myself to look deeper and say to myself, in what ways am I not an adult? And what can I do about it? I was able to look at my traumas. I was able to look at the sides of myself that were stunted, that had been stunted long, long, long ago in my childhood, often in my early childhood. Areas in myself which I was still unresolved, and I was stuck in the ages of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. And all those emotions were still confused and still hadn't really moved past those early ages. I've heard it said, and now I really see it as true, is that when people get traumatized in childhood at different places, different ages in their childhood, they often really get stuck at those ages. They don't really grow much beyond it until they grieve the loss, they grieve the trauma, they heal that trauma. That is what allows the parts of themselves that are stunted and childlike, childish when they're actual physical, biological adults, that's what allows those parts to catch up after a long, long time. It's healing those traumas. Now, I got a big clue about this right when I became a therapist. I became a therapist when I was 27 years old in New York City. And my first job, it was an internship where I got to see, I don't know what it was, 10, 12 clients a week, was at a place called the Manhattan Vet Center. It was a counseling center for combat veterans, most of whom had been in Vietnam. And so my first clients, when I was a therapist, this was back in 1999, when I was 27, my first clients were Vietnam combat veterans, and it was really intense. I had all these guys who were in their 50s, most of them were in their 50s, late 50s, some of them were into their 60s even. And I was sitting down with them, I was their therapist, they were 25, 30 years older than me, most of them. And I remember feeling like, this feels awkward. This feels like an imbalance, like, wait a second. When I look inside of myself and I'm getting the answer, I'm not fully an adult, I feel like a kid, and I look in the mirror and I actually was only 27 and I looked younger. And then I'm looking across from me at these clients who to me looked much more like adults. I thought, why would they want to sit with me and tell me about their most painful experiences, about their post-traumatic stress, about their shame, about the horrible things they'd done in their lives, the horrible things that had been done to them, their pain, their insecurity. Why would they want to tell some guy who was at least 20, 30 years younger than them? It really brought up a lot of my insecurities. And one thing I learned as a therapist, which was a tool as a therapist, it's a wonderful tool that I started using all the time, which was, oh, I have an insecurity. There's ways that I can frame it and bring it up right in the session. So I would ask my clients, sometimes just because it would burst out of me, I'd say, are you okay with actually sitting with someone who's so much younger than you? Is it awkward for you? Or sometimes they even brought it up first. They would say, ooh, I didn't expect to have a therapist who looked so young or is so young. So I'd want to talk about it with them. How does it feel? Do you want to have a better therapist, a different therapist? Do you want to switch to someone else? So I asked this to a lot of my clients, and I got a surprising response. They said, I was in Vietnam when I was 18 years old. I was in Vietnam when I was 19 years old. And I suffered horrible traumas. Horrible things happened to me. I witnessed horrible things. I killed people. I saw people get killed. I saw my friends get killed. I saw horrible violations of human beings. I lost my faith in humanity. I maybe lost my mind. I was traumatized at 18. I was traumatized at 19. And I was traumatized profoundly. And as the result of that trauma, and this is what they told me again and again and again, they said, I didn't grow after that. And I think a lot of these veterans had met in groups. What I found is they would talk about this with each other, and they had figured it out with themselves, probably not with therapists at all. And what they said was they got stunted at a certain level by their trauma. Their emotional, psychological development and whole areas of their personality didn't grow up past the age of 18 and 19. So what they told me is they said, I'm 53 years old, I'm 54 years old, I'm 58 years old. And emotionally, in whole areas of my personality, I'm still 18 and 19. And what they said to me is, they said, Daniel, you may look young, you may be 27 years old or whatever you are, but actually, I look at you as more of an adult than I am because you didn't get stuck in the way that I got stuck. So I feel like I'm an 18-year-old talking to someone who is in their late 20s. And I feel like because of that, you have a lot of insight that can help me. And I actually like it that you're younger than some of these guys that are 50 and 60 because I feel even more ashamed when I'm with people who are in their 50s and 60s. I feel like there's even more of a gap between me and them. I feel like you're closer in age to me, so you can help me better. You know what it's like to be 18 and 19 because you were there pretty recently. And I remember thinking, maybe they're right. This is actually something that's very hopeful. I didn't have any of those guys quit on me. And actually, what I found in that year of working with them is that they were pretty much right. A lot of them had dilemmas. A lot of the conflicts and the dilemmas that they'd had repeated in their lives for the last 30 years since they were 18 and 19 years old were dilemmas of the variety of people who were late teenagers. They were really stuck replaying teenage patterns over and over and over again. Drug use, relationships that didn't last, violations that they were doing on other people, ways that they didn't have boundaries, ways that they couldn't survive in the workplace, all sorts of inappropriate anger, confusion about their role in relationships with others, confusion on their jobs. Yeah, substance abuse problems, like I said, a lot of kind of like teenage stuff. They were stuck there. Now, to bring it back to the bigger subject of what it is to be an adult, something that I learned from that experience was the value in having humility. And they really helped me. And that was something that was totally unexpected in being a therapist and having people come and sit in my office, wherever my office happened to be. And later when I was working with all sorts of people, not just veterans, women, men, younger people, older people, sometimes very old people, people of different cultures, is hearing people talk about their life histories, talk about the ways in which they were stuck, the ways in which they were making repeated mistakes throughout their life, sometimes for decades. In a way, it gave me the safety to have even more courage, to have as much courage as I could, to really look at myself and to say, wait a second, if these people have the humility to come in and do what they're doing, open themselves up to me, a virtual stranger, and basically open themselves up to their grief process, to their trauma history, to all this painful stuff, to look at their behavior for decades, things that maybe didn't look so good. I can do this. I can do this better. And I should do this. This is a responsibility I have, not just to any client I have, to be the best person, the best therapist I can be, but primarily a responsibility to myself, to grow up. And in a strange way, in part, I learned this even before I became a therapist. And the main way I learned it is that when I took childlike, split off, dissociated, traumatized parts of myself, frozen parts of myself that were stuck at earlier ages, stuck at age 5, 7, 10, whatever it was, and I accessed them, and I worked out the dynamics. I worked out what had happened to me then. I worked out why I responded the ways I did. I worked out ways in which I'd been traumatized before that that led me to be more traumatized by those experiences. When I started to reclaim my feelings from being 5 or 7 or 10, and I grieved the losses, when I changed my behavior, even before, and I was doing this process long before I became a therapist, what I saw is that it felt great. It felt great to grow up. It felt great to reclaim those split-off childlike parts of myself and to incorporate them into a more adult way in my personality, to become more of an adult, to become more of a whole adult. And in a way, every child already knows this. Children love the feeling of growing up. They love the feeling of becoming more wise about the world, more knowledgeable. Children love becoming more mature. Now, there are examples. I know some people who say, I hated growing up. Getting older only made my life worse. And there's certain areas, of course, in which this is true. Bad things can happen as people get older and they can lose idyllic parts of their childhood. But fundamentally, I think there's a natural, spontaneous drive in all of us to become adults, to grow toward adulthood. So for me, having discovered that healing my traumas was the primary way, once I was physically an adult, to actually catch up emotionally and to become more of an actual adult, I learned that that felt great. And that gave my life a deeper purpose, a deeper meaning, a deeper value. I watched so many of my friends from college, most of them in fact, go off because what we were trained to do in college was to gain some sort of skills and to go forth and become productive members of society as adults. Get a relationship, start a family going, make a career, make a lot of money, bank accounts, 401ks, and and titles and letters after our name and important jobs and responsibility. And I've done some of that. And sometimes I've done it pretty well. I did it a little later than most, and I found that did feel good. And that actually did help give me a vote of confidence in myself to become a working, productive member of society. That really did feel good, but it felt much, much better, and it felt much more important, much more fundamentally valuable for me to do that healing on the inside. Not just to be a surface functioning adult member of society, but on a real emotional level, on a gut level, on a psychological level, in my relationship with myself, in my relationship with the world, to become an adult, to resolve these traumas. And actually, the funny thing is, the more that I've done that, resolved my traumas, healed my traumas, really integrated those old parts of myself that were split off and hurt, and allowed them to actually become more mature, so I could become more of a whole adult, I found the more that I've done that, the more actually I could function in society well. And what I've also found is that functioning in society, in so many ways, is very difficult. As a traumatized person, it was very hard. It's very confusing, often, to function in this weird, dishonest world. I sometimes think, though, people who are very, very split off and very traumatized, they can do well because they can manipulate. It's so much of a world of manipulation. So much of the modern adult world, especially making a lot of money, is about manipulating others, not being honest, and things like that. So sometimes very traumatized people who are very stunted children actually do well, because I think society a lot of times is run by people who are just very pathological, emotional children. However, what I have found by being a more healthy, healed, emotional adult, and by the way, I'm not all the way there. I still have unresolved traumas. I've still got parts of me that are stuck and stunted, and I'm still working on it, and I probably will for the rest of my life. However, being more mature, being more healthy, being more functional in a way emotionally, having the full range of my feelings, being connected with me much, much more, has allowed me a lot more options in functioning as an adult. I get along better at my jobs. I do work that I like more. I'm more attracted to work that I'm good at, that I like, that's productive, that helps other people, that helps the world. And I find that very freeing. So I find, in a way, being an emotional adult has helped me be a more actual adult in the world. However, a lot of these ideals of society, have that formal job, work for years and years and years, and button up my collar and put on a tie and be a man and, you know, get married and have kids and have a car and have a house and have a mortgage and a 401k. This, to me, is not being an adult. To me, being an adult, especially in this very confused modern world that's heading in a very weird direction, I think, a very unpredictable direction. Nobody knows what it's going to be like in 50 years, 70 years. Well, for me, the best way that I can be an adult in this world is to be that emotional adult. That emotional adult that I wasn't allowed to fully grow toward as a child, but that I have begun for the last couple of decades to really reclaim. That, for me, is something that feels really good in this world, and hopefully by being more of an adult and being more open and humble about my process, clumsy, confusing, messy process of healing my traumas and becoming more of an adult, hopefully I can inspire other people to do the same thing.